Pleasure to introduce Dr. Barbara J. Falk, who is a professor at the Canadian Forces College in Toronto, and she is also the acting director of academics. And since I am on contract to the college, she actually is also my boss. So when I saw that Dr. Falk would be prepared to take on the role of keynote speaker, I absolutely jumped at that, and that worked out well. The other thing I would point out that some of you may not be aware of is that we actually had Dr. Falk speak to the RCMI in the BC era before COVID. And at the time I asked her, would she talk about the idea of the West and Russia being in a Cold War? So I understood at that time what her view was. And when I decided that I would use the framework of a Cold Wars II framework for this conference, Dr. Falk was actually the first person that I thought of inviting, because I knew she would have very interesting views on this subject. So the fact that we're now able to actually offer her a longer period of time to speak than she would have otherwise had she remained in one of the two panels, this is a good thing. So please have a look at Dr. Falk's impressive biography in the program. I won't go through it. She's been published, she's been teaching, and she has lots of interesting research areas. And I'll just mention one, that being that Dr. Falk teaches in one of the electives at the college in the field of genocide. So I suspect that there might be some discussion of that term in the context of what we're seeing happening in Ukraine. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Barbara Falk for her comments. Thank you very much.
First, Dan, thanks so much for extending me again a kind invitation to address an RCMI audience. The only thing from my perspective that would be better is if I could actually be joining you in person at the Institute, which I can actually see from my 47th floor perch in downtown Toronto. Thanks also to my fellow participants for their comments today. I'm again reminded how fortunate we were to bring Dr. Bettina Rentz to the CFC as our distinguished visiting professor just prior to the onset of COVID, and how motivated I am now to do my utmost to figure out how to bring her back to complete her term. Thanks also to Dr. Dawson and also to Lieutenant Colonel Steve Day. It's nice to see you again. For some time now, I've actually seen my research worlds kind of colliding and collapsing in on one another. And so I'm going to make part of this discussion a little bit personal and biographical in order to explain what I mean. And then I'm going to kind of sidestep into a larger discussion about Russia-Ukraine, but also perhaps the sort of larger global order we're in the middle of right now. So I'm a professor, as you know, working in professional military education at the Canadian Forces College, where over the last 17 years, my teaching focus has been on international relations, national security law and policy, and mass atrocity violence, genocide. The narrative arc of my research can be summarized in one sentence. And by God, it took me about 20 years to be able to summarize my research in one sentence. The persecution and prosecution of domestic dissent, particularly refracted through and conditioned by international conflict. My current research focuses on Cold War political trials. My dissertation, so this is going back some decades ago, looked at the oeuvre of dissident theory and practice in 3 states in the former Soviet bloc, Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. So some of what's happened there will also inform my thinking. I advanced the thesis at that time, a thesis I still believe in, that ideas profoundly matter in the shaping of history, and the independent thought and action of dissidents created fledgling civil societies within formerly communist states. And we know how important active and productive civil societies are to the creation and maintenance of democracies, and I would say the liberal order writ large. Mitchell Europa, Central Europe, and Cold War politics and history have always been consistent, regular interests of mine. I teach a series of lectures on European defense and security to military and civilian audiences every year. More recently, I've been doing some thinking and writing on hybrid warfare. I share Dr. Rentz's skepticism and how civil societies are effectively weaponized through systematic mis- and disinformation to promote polarization and sow social mistrust. We know, and we're, I think, becoming ever more aware, that social cohesion, trust, resilience are the products of social learning, acculturation, education, and require consistent normative reinforcement. Yet we've all come to discover just how these values and attributes can be attacked and dismantled, much as democracy and the liberal order itself has come under attack. Until recently, however, my interests, my teaching areas of expertise were kind of nicely siloed. There were overlaps, of course, and I could cross-pollinate to some degree between and among teaching and research subjects and projects. With what's happened in the last several months, I feel like this is no longer the case. Everything has collided and collapsed together. Allow me to explain, and in so doing, I'm going to explain the complicated intersections of geography and politics in Eastern Europe, the legacies of history in that region, conspiratorial thinking and the politicization of justice, new forms of what Mark Leonard calls unpeace. I would say dissent fits in here, but also attacks under the legal threshold of war, as well as the dark underbelly of neoliberal globalization and connectivity, and finally, the current nature of great power conflict. Moreover, I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine serves as a real-life, real-time example. Spoiler alert, and I'm not saying anything new here, given the views of my fellow panelists, none of this adds up to Cold War 2.0. First, legacies. Central and Eastern Europe has long been a laboratory of tragedy. In what Timothy Snyder calls the bloodlands of Europe, we have seen the collapse of empires, the emergence of new states that either promoted or bought into racialized and other forms of ascriptive identities upon which to build nationhood, the rise of authoritarian communism, fascism, and more positively and recently, the military and political defeat of fascism and the collapse of communism. Ideologies have been supported in this part of the world and have dramatically failed. I do not want to suggest any cyclical notion of history here. To do so would be both nihilistic and frankly rob ourselves and others of agency to change the course of events. But I do want to point out that these legacies are heavy. Now, we know that legacies can be mobilized for positive ends. To wit, the World War II experience generated the ideas and practices about the world's most confounding and simultaneously impressive supranational institution, the European Union. The EU has championed and now embodies the ideals of pooled sovereignty, integration, concerted action, social solidarity, and the preference for negotiated solutions over the use of force. The EU was built first and foremost as a political solution to an enduring security dilemma: how to unite first the industries of war, then economies more generally, and finally the core competencies of states themselves through a web of political institutions, something that is more than a collection of treaties, but not a federation of states either. However, legacies can also be mobilized for very harmful ends. And recently we have seen this through false and conspiratorial dot connecting into a narrative of grievance that justifies a resort to force. This is exactly how Russian President Vladimir Putin has linked political and historical data points and has crafted a narrative in which Russia is the victim of the West, the expansion of NATO and the EU into former Soviet space, one example, the 2002 American withdrawal from the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, more recently, the stationing of missile defense systems in Poland, even parodying and misrepresenting diversity and inclusion laws and policies aimed at addressing longstanding inequities of the LGBTQ community and of women as quote unquote ideology. All are aimed at somehow reducing Russian security or existentially challenging this narrative of Russian civilizational norms and history. In the Putin variation of this story, Ukraine becomes the aggressor bent on the genocide of Russians, and the very idea of Ukraine becomes an affront to real/legitimate Russia. From the study of genocide, I know that mass atrocity violence begins not only with dehumanization, but also with the deliberate construction of the other as a security threat. How better to do so than by constructing Ukraine as inherently fascist, requiring necessary denazification by force. Inconveniently situated in the heart of the bloodlands, Ukraine does have an unfortunate and tragic history that has included complicity in the Holocaust, but it has also been the victim of Stalin-induced famine, the Holodomor, that in Canada we recognize as a genocide. Some data points, such as Indigenous support for fascism and resistance to the USSR, are fused into a usable past, politically mobilized to serve the needs of Moscow. Other points, such as Stalinist crime or longstanding efforts of Ukrainians to assert their national identity against all odds, these are, inconvenient truths that are routinely denied or claimed as anti-Russian, or in the past, as anti-Soviet aggression. Meanwhile, the European Union is not a force for unity and progressive politics in this kind of narrative. Rather, the messy diversity and contestation of the Union affords a perfect opportunity to foment dissent. I'm always reminded that the flip side of civil society is uncivil society. And sadly, this has been easy to do in the recent past, given the existence of Eurosceptic parties and politicians, the rise of illiberalism, ethno-nationalism, and right-wing populism. Too often in the recent past, European politicians, such as the now re-elected Viktor Orban in Hungary, or presidential contender Marine Le Pen in France, have either been willing dupes or crass opportunists in their support for Putin and his Russia, or both. Now, conspiratorial thinking is in and of itself nothing new. And Russia and the Soviet Union, this has been its strong suit, sowing dissension between East and West and blaming Western collusion and interference for the failures of communist states to deliver the promised utopia, allowed for Soviet advisors to eliminate political foes through show trials, first in the USSR in the 1930s, later in Eastern Europe following the Second World War. We can think of these Soviet actions as kind of an early form of lawfare, where trials were used to scapegoat and then liquidate political enemies blamed for the lack of progress towards this communist utopia. Furthermore, the use of conspiracy offenses allowed the state to construct a fictionalized plot and torture former communist leaders into confessing to a litany of crimes: espionage, treason, and sabotage in our parlance, Trotskyism, Zionism, Titoism, bourgeois nationalism, and imperialism in the parlance of the then party state. Conspiracy law is very helpful because you can apprehend in advance of any action, useful if you want to foil a terrorist attack, but equally useful if you want to use the law as a weapon of war against domestic dissent. The problem with this kind of politicization of justice is the authoritarian temptation to use the criminal justice system to eliminate regime adversaries in a crass ploy to legitimize their consolidation of power and promote a binary friends versus enemies worldview that affords no nuance nor challenge. Putin has used law at every single turn, and not just recently. The 2012 Pussy Riot trial, the 2005 trial, sentencing, and imprisonment of Mikhail Khodorkovsky now appear to us as unheeded early warning signs. We too often looked the other way when Russia was turning the authoritarian screw on Russians, even when we were not fooled by the label of a managed democracy. After all, much of Europe has so depended on Russian natural resources. And examples are legion. the 2015 assassination of Boris Nemtsov, the massive crackdown on domestic dissent after the 2012 and 2018 elections, the more recent detention and incarceration of those protesting the invasion of Ukraine. Let's be clear, the audience here is both international and domestic. In Putinesque thinking, the collapse of communism was a disaster of world historic proportions. The most important thing to be avoided are what were derisively called the colored revolutions, for example, that infected states such as Georgia and Ukraine and threatened states such as Belarus and Kazakhstan. Usually Western states, NGOs, and of course, the ubiquitous villain George Soros are chiefly to blame. Nothing scares authoritarians more than when their own populations turn on them. And the horrifying calculus becomes, how many of your own citizens do you detain, arrest, imprison, disappear, or massacre in order to hold on to power? After all, authoritarians, precisely because they reject the key job of actual democratic elections, which is to provide for the orderly transition of power, have guaranteed for themselves a built-in and never-ending succession crisis. What is happening inside Russia right now is deeply depressing, but in another view, just to throw in a little bit of optimism here, it is heartening to see so much dissent under such impossible conditions. I'm not a Pollyanna here. I would agree with my colleagues that Putin is not going down anytime soon. However, I like to remind my colleagues that after the August 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia, which was then dressed up as fraternal assistance, either 7 or 8 Russians demonstrated in Red Square. And yeah, there's actually an academic debate on whether or not it was 7 or 8, but I won't get into that. Much more has happened now following the invasion of Ukraine, and the truth keeps leaking out via person-to-person contact, often within families. This is not surprising. Even under the cover of war between the two nastiest totalitarian powers, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, the Soviets could not keep the secret of the 1940 Katyn massacre a secret. This was, of course, the mass execution of nearly the entire Polish officer corps and the country's leading intelligentsia, nearly 22,000 people. And it didn't take months for the news to leak out, only weeks. Before the internet, the truth will out. It would be, however, equally reductive and dangerous would we now slide into a simplistic resuscitation of Cold War thinking where we equate Russian leadership with Russians and focus on what in general is seen in public with Putin in the same manner Sovietologists used to pay attention to who stood next to whom in the annual May Day parade as the latest and greatest in military hardware were driven past to message superpower glory. Cold War triumphalism was real and did exclude and demonize Russia. There was an alternative. We may demean it and ridicule it now, but there was an alternative offered by Mikhail Gorbachev in terms of a common European security infrastructure. Yet, of course, we also know that Gorbachev's own political fortunes were rapidly waning in the time period following the fall of the Berlin Wall in '89 and the putsch against his own leadership in August 1991. As well, we know in retrospect that former Soviet states indicated fast and early their desire to be on the European team, which in practical meant NATO membership and joining the EU, even at the expense of some hard-won sovereignty. Yet those deals were also problematic, fodder for zero-sum calculations of wins and losses, not only for Russia, but for many average citizens across the region who did see a rising tide that floated all boats, to be sure, but also a massive rise in inequality, oligarchic personal enrichment, corrupt privatization, all occurring in a there is no alternative form of globalization that enshrined Washington consensus ideals over the lived experiences of the losers, those who lost their jobs, their pensions, their cradle-to-grave social safety net, in effect, their human security. Often in Eastern Europe, those middle-aged at the time of the transition could not easily retool linguistically or instantly retrofit themselves as knowledge workers. If this East European experience sounds familiar, it is. It's another version of the same story of what has happened in advanced post-industrial democracies, with the development of global supply chains, technology replacing or changing the nature of work, the offshoring of unskilled and semi-skilled jobs to low-wage export processing zones. In the West, we have also seen the shrinking support for taxation to support large-scale social programs, demands for decreased taxes to promote jobs and growth, a shiny fictional veneer under which we can see a shrinking middle class, a gig economy of precarious labor, an increasing gulf between the, not the 1%, but the 0.01% and the rest. Today, we have a lack of affordable housing, but that's been going on for a while. We've also had the subprime mortgage crisis in the US, the euro crisis, unaffordable euro-denominated mortgages in Central and Eastern Europe, all real experiences explained by tabloid and later social media and later government-managed media as the fault of urban elites, illegal migrants, the EU, government more generally. All of this fed Brexit, Orban in Hungary, the Law and Justice Party in Poland, and the continued popularity of Donald Trump. And in another variant, again, another variant, not entirely different, the enduring support a majority of Russians have for Vladimir Putin. After he came to power in 2000, the Second Chechen War ended in victory, although I put victory in scare quotes because that was, that's how it was sold. Energy prices rose, the economy boomed, Russians could afford to travel, their lives materially improved. Globalization meant increased connectivity, increased comparison, and the politics of envy and resentment. We have seen with access to information how everyone lives everywhere with a celebrity culture of largely unattainable wealth and status. Meanwhile, I don't think we can afford to have the old binary constructions of the Cold War because we are not mirrored opposites. We live in a broken mirror instead. The shards of the mirror reflect and refract in many directions at once. Given this reality, we have already been analyzing new forms of conflict, hybrid operations just under the legal threshold of attack, the weaponization of our societies against ourselves. Yet one thing that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has taught us that we've kind of forgotten an important lesson of technology and history. Technology can sometimes replace earlier forms of operation and modes of thinking, but at other times, there's kind of a layering process. Motion pictures did not render photography obsolete, television did not force radio into oblivion, and social media, weaponized or not, does not replace traditional media, but rather heightens the need for it. As the Russian invasion of Ukraine has demonstrated, we don't just have hybrid or cyber warfare, but the old scalable mass attack land-based variety of air operations with indiscriminate bombing, tanks maneuvering or not to encircle cities, new kinds of anti-tank and anti-aircraft weaponry, but old forms of tactical use. As the old school Clausewitzian principles, such as the importance of morale, the inevitability of friction, the primacy of talented and courageous leadership, all these come into play once more. In terms of great power conflict, Russia has not broken a post-war European taboo on aggressive war. In my view, that was already done with the wars of the Yugoslav succession in the 1990s. How China responds to the current situation will depend on how things unfold. If the Chinese have one ace in their hole, it's an enormous amount of strategic patience and willingness to play a long game. Yet again, none of this adds up to a new Cold War. Parallels are often mistaken and misleading. The OG Cold War was a contest of rival powers, but also rival ideologies and political and economic systems. Most states were forced to pick sides and rely on either the patronage of either the United States or the Soviet Union, and changing sides was a risky business indeed. Neither Russia nor China have anything novel to add to the already existing mix of possibilities. Corrupt klepto-capitalism has been proven to coexist nicely in the past and will do so in the future. Only a hearts and minds winning formula with an implicit social contract delivers tangible goods, however measured, and has staying power. Russia was able to do that in the 2000s. China still can, even while growth has slowed. But it remains to be seen how long these highly transactional forms of legitimacy can last. Russia has no prevailing ideology, so casting the debate from the Russian perspective into binary and civilizational terms, combined with a selective and revisionist account of history, provides some appeal. We just don't know yet how much or for how long such an approach can be sustained. Thanks very much.
Barbara, thanks very much for that. I certainly am going to have a couple of questions for you. But what I would like to do now is invite Michael and Steve and Dr. Renz and Fraser as well to come on online. We do have a couple of questions coming out of the audience. I have 3 or 4. Feel free to ask questions of yourselves as well, if you so desire. But let me start with a question about Russia and China. We've been thinking mostly at this point, for obvious reasons, about sort of, security concerns with respect to, potential kinetic conflict. But China in particular, and probably to a slightly lesser degree, Russia has been very active in terms of investing in the Canadian economy, acquiring companies that have strategic value. So in that sense, they are playing a multi-dimensional game, and they're doing that independently. But at the same time, we've now seen recently where there's a kind of potential rapprochement between Russia and China. And I'm wondering if anybody has a view on those aspects of the non-Cold War from that economic dimension, and also whether the potential for a Russia-China treaty, if you will, or at least an alignment, heightens the danger to the West, or is that not something that we need to concern ourselves with?
Well, I can jump in and just say one lesson of history is that we kind of overplayed the connection and tried to make far too unified a group of communist states during the Cold War, and we didn't afford, complexity or nuance, or we misunderstood when nuance was there. For a while, Ceausescu was considered a liberal darling because he had an independent foreign policy and didn't participate in the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. Like, in retrospect, that seems like a laughable interpretation, right? So I think there's a danger in overplaying the power that Russia and China together represent. I do think the danger is actually more from Russia's perspective in terms of becoming increasingly an economic vassal of China. And China has far greater amounts of economic, political, and military power at this stage than Russia does. So I think the danger is more on the Russian side.
Okay. Anyone else like to address that question?
I wonder if China still has ideas about who should really own a lot of that Siberian landmass. I'm not familiar with the sort of academic writing in China, but it would be interesting to know what scholars of their international relations and their national interests think about who really should be the proprietor of that enormous storehouse of resources. I don't know.
Speak to that a little bit. We used to do some research with a colleague of mine who's a China expert on the Russian Far East and the relations between Russia and China in that regard. during the 1990s, indeed, that was a big issue from the Russian point of view. In particular, actually, the view on China was quite xenophobic in many ways. I remember we did a project also on migration and so on of Chinese into the Russian Far East. Of course, that border had been heavily militarized during the Cold War, and when that border no longer was so militarized, a lot of Chinese traders and so on came over the border, selling their wares and so on in Siberia. And there was a fear there in Russia in the 1990s in particular that China would have might pose a threat to that particular territory. Now, and that would be, this sort of idea they will come in and take over slowly because it's so underpopulated, and they come in and marry our Russian women and so on. But those tables have turned a little bit because, of course, at the end of the day, there isn't all that much. There are some resources, but apart from that, there isn't very much on the Russian side of the border in the very Far East. So actually, the way things have been going, it's the other way around. That young Russians from the Far East actually went into China and worked there and saw their opportunities there and so on. So from the Russian point of view, at least as far as I know, this is no longer very much seen as a major worry. That was very much a concern of the 1990s. Much more from the Russian point of view, the concern is this economic disparity that Barbara just mentioned. That China, obviously economically, it's much stronger than Russia, that China more or less uses Russia as a sort of backyard for natural resources and so on, timber, oil, gas, and some other materials, and that China continues to develop economically, whereas Russia does not. The relationship between Russia and China is, of course, an interesting one. I think it is stronger than some people like to see. It has been much more long-lasting and than some people expected. A lot of people thought that, especially in Central Asia, the respective interests might lead to conflict, but somehow that has worked out. There seems to be an agreement that China takes the lead on the economic side, whereas Russia takes the lead on the security side, and there's a bit of a sort of shared effort in Central Asia. But in the long term, I think from the Chinese perspective, the relationship with the US and with the West economically is much more important ultimately than the one with Russia. So I think when it came down to it, China will keep in mind also now when it comes to its relationship vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine, that it cannot really spoil this relationship with the West completely. So China is more important to Russia than the other way around. And of course, they have some common sort of normative interests as well in terms of the anti-US, anti-Westernism, criticism of humanitarian interventions and so on, voting in the UN. But this is not an ideological convergence as such, as Barbara said. Obviously, Russia is certainly no longer a communist country. It's like the worst form of capitalism in a way, so that there's not much shared values in that regard.
So if I could just take that conversation just in a slightly different perspective, that is, most of the academic literature with respect to the Arctic has characterized it as an uncontested space. It was viewed as a cooperative space, that most of the states that have Arctic territory cooperate, for example, by being members of the Arctic Council. And of course, we've seen a significant increase in Chinese interest in the Arctic for several reasons. And of course, they now characterize themselves as a near Arctic state. Now we have a situation in Ukraine where this has caused Russia to be pushed out of the Arctic Council. And so I'm wondering whether we're starting to see, are we starting to see any indicators that the Arctic may be more of a contested space? And if so, what does that imply for the Canadian government and the Canadian Armed Forces? I was chatting with students the other day about this issue, and one of the big concerns is, as an example, is that much of the the seafloor in the Arctic region has not been mapped, which means that when you have these great, huge ships going through, these tourist ships, there's a real possibility that one of them might either sink or get stuck. And what capabilities does Canada have to actually respond to a huge potential humanitarian threat in that region, especially if, for example, the ship started to leak huge quantities of oil, which could then wash up on the shores. Any thoughts on whether the Ukraine situation now has starting to have ripple effects in the Arctic?
I'll jump in there a little bit. I mean, I think the whole notion of the Arctic is primarily a cooperative space. I mean, part of that is, it's also our own propaganda, and it's part of, the Arctic Council's spiel about itself. I would note there are some Canadian commentators. This isn't by and large a universally shared view, but certainly the work of Rob Hubert at the University of Calgary suggests that now and in the future, we're going to see a much more securitized Arctic than we've seen in the past. And that our disputes over, for example, the waters, is it territorial or international strait and so on, is something that is going to become a much more live sovereignty issue for Canada. Having said that, I think Russia has actually quite very legitimate interests in Arctic waters and everything else. I mean, they have, the Northern Sea Route. They are, legitimately geographically a northern power. There's no contesting that. The Chinese, of course, are very interested in transiting through our waters, however characterized. And, this, of course, raises the age-old discussion in Canadian politics about, claiming the Arctic to be important, but not, putting the resources there to make it matter. It's not just about, people. It's not just about, small militarized units and spaces. It's a much deeper ongoing engagement that it has to happen on so many levels. And I think in our case should involve a lot of environmental stewardship. I think there's been some really good writing in Canada on asserting sovereignty through environmental stewardship. And, that's something that I think we could probably all agree on. But more contested in the future because of, or as a result of the Russia-Ukraine situation. I think that it's affected in so far as the ripples of what's happened are, it seems to be kind of a world ordering moment, hence the Arctic Council decision, but it doesn't come out of a vacuum. I mean, this evolution of thinking about security in the Canadian Arctic, I think has been ongoing for quite some time.
Okay. Maybe if I could add one smaller point to that.
Please do.
I think it goes back to my earlier comment about lacking a national security strategy, lacking or having very finite resources. What is in our national interest to protect? And so when we look at military operations in the high north, make no mistake about that. That is specialized military operations for the general purpose force. You just can't take any ship, send it up into the high Arctic. We certainly can't send our submarines up there for 10 months of the year. So when we look at what should we be doing, and we look at Russia or China and their interest in the high north, that is specialized operating environments. And if we want to get serious about that, which I do think we should, then we need to make some significant investments, and we're not there right yet.
Okay.
If I could chime in a bit here.
Yes,
I think
please.
the investments we need to make on the military side are probably situational awareness investments. We need to surveil the landmass. We need to restore underwater surveillance in various places. And I think we need to make the little naval jetty a sort of bigger thing than it's planned to be. But my take on a lot of this is that effective control over what our landmass in the Arctic is as much a civilian issue as it is a military one. Canada has to be seen to be offering the services of any normal nation state to its people. We have to have policing, we have to have public health, we have to have education facilities for our people. And at the same time, if our water is going to be used as a passageway. Under the International Maritime Organization, I believe we have obligations for navigational assistance, and I think that probably extends to search and rescue. So it's partly military, but we should never forget that a lot of the ordinary business of the state needs to be upfront in the Arctic and known to people that we are in control.
Okay. We're getting close to the end. I'm going to pose one more question. It's kind of an undercurrent of some of what has been discussed and some interest on the part of various attendees. I don't think we can leave this conference without addressing this issue, which is how does this thing in Ukraine end? So let me put it in sort of international relations terms. You probably have heard of the ideas of positive and negative peace. So, you know, negative peace is when the shooting stops. But the underlying causes of the conflict have not been addressed. Positive peace is when the shooting stops and the underlying causes of the conflict have been addressed. We saw that in Afghanistan, clearly the last 20 years was a state of negative peace. It wasn't positive peace. Therefore, what happened made sense with the Taliban taking over. So the question is, if, given everything we know, Putin decided tomorrow morning to pull all of his forces out of Ukraine and back into Russia, we now have a status of negative peace. What would positive peace look like in this situation? How do we put Humpty Dumpty back together again to February the 23rd? Given the destruction that has occurred, given the people who have been killed, who is going to rebuild Ukraine? Who's going to pay for it? Who will be held accountable for what has happened in terms of the human tragedy? What does that look like from your perspective?
I'm going to do that crazy.
Go ahead.
I can do that crazy academic thing, Dan, and challenge the question.
Okay.
I don't like the words peace or war anymore because I think they're actually quite ideological. I prefer words like conflict and stability because I think they reflect contemporary reality as opposed to, you know, post World War II universes that frankly we no longer live in and haven't for a long time. So I'm going to slightly rejig in that way. It was interesting when you said, like, let's go back to the way it was before. And then you said, you know, February, you know, second week of February. And I will note that in the second week of February, the Russian troops weren't pulled back all the way in the sense that there was already a proxy war going on in the Donbass, in Donetsk and Luhansk. So it depends what you mean by the before, right? We're not talking 2014 before, we're talking February 2022 before. And in that sense, I think the end game, or more what you might want to call the perpetual unpeace, is not going to be necessarily a pullback to Donetsk and Luhansk. I think the Russians will pursue a scorched earth, you know, Grozny, Aleppo type strategy to secure the land corridor between Crimea and Donetsk and Luhansk. We'll see if they're successful. If you were to see some kind of stopping of this, it wouldn't be the pullback or the unconditional surrender or victory that's being looked for. Again, I think that's unrealistic post World War II category. But I do think we could see some kind of ceasefire or stalemate where we end up in a kind of a frozen politics situation, a la North and South Korea, East versus West Germany, where you have to wait for a very long time for an eventual political reckoning or solution. And that's not something that we're going to see happen anytime soon. Having said that, I don't think even getting there is, you know, any time within the weeks or months to come. I think we're going to see a lot more devastation and a lot more bad news than good news.
Okay. Steve?
Yeah, no, I would agree. I don't see anything in the short term other than more pain, suffering. It's going to be horrendous in the short term. Where I guess I'm conflicted on this, and I would use the Afghan example that you spoke to earlier and the Ukraine example. From my relatively simple perch, is that we're at this point in the 21st century where it's truly a battle or a tension between ways of living. And I think the West, with our liberal democratic institutions and all the greatness that allows us to prosper, we need to understand that what we thought came out of the Second World War didn't actually come out of the Second World War in this enduring human conflict, that we're going to have these tensions between nation states. We've had a 70-year relative peace, even though it wasn't peaceful. And so I think from the Western point of view, and specifically the Canadian point of view, it's time for us to understand that's a big, bad world out there, because I do agree Ukraine is probably going to become a bit of a frozen conflict. But when you look at Afghanistan and Ukraine as an example, like Ukraine was given 30 years to get their house in order, and they could not meet the EU, NATO, or Western standards for governance. Afghanistan, we gave them 20 years. So at what point do we say as Western liberal democracies that yes, we're willing to invest blood, sweat, and tears to make better lives for people, but at some point when the door is open, you've got to walk through it. And I realize that's some harsh words, because what we're seeing in these nations unfolding against these populations is not the population's fault. It's the governance, it's the leadership, it's those oligarchs, it's whatever that might be. So I try to be a bit of a realist and go, and I look at Ukraine. They had 30 years to get aligned with the EU. That's a long time.
Okay.
Okay, I want to say something about that. So, of course, I think the comparison between Afghanistan and Ukraine is not a particularly good one, to be honest. I mean, you have to also bear in mind that, of course, a lot of the economic problems and a lot of the pressure in Ukraine has come from Russia, is especially over the last 10 years or so, that economic development was absolutely impossible since 2014 because it was Russia. And we shouldn't forget that, of course, Russia is the aggressor and has been since 2014 that has that has created so many problems for Ukraine. Also, I think from a political point of view, you cannot compare Afghanistan and Ukraine. I've conducted research fieldwork both in Russia and in Ukraine. And certainly, yes, of course, we shouldn't pretend like everything was fine in Ukraine before. Of course, there were some issues with corruption and so on still, but it's still it was pluralistic society, different political parties. Ukraine has had 6 different presidents that have been elected popularly compared to Russia, for example. And I mean, Afghanistan is just not really something you can compare. Also, as I said before in my, I think I said it either in an answer or in my talk, Ukraine actually was pretty much neutral until 2014, right? The Ukrainian leadership and also the population largely understood that they are next to Russia, that it's like a conflict from their point of view with Russia is not in their interest in the long term, because you need to somehow get along. And actually, up until 2014, there was absolutely no interest, really serious interest, at least in Ukraine, to join NATO, for example. They were in the Partnership for Peace. Of course, President Yushchenko between 2006 and 2010 spoke about potentially NATO membership, but it was a completely political non-starter. And with the EU as well, I mean, that it was never really on the cards that they would, become. And also it shouldn't. Again, I mean, talking about sovereignty and countries' rights to choose, I don't think we can't say it's either you're with us or you're against us, or Ukraine either needed to join NATO in the EU or not. Not joining NATO or the EU didn't necessarily need to mean that Ukraine is pro-Russian or is under Russia's influence. The problem is that Russia did not want Ukraine to make its own decisions in that respect. So I think, again, I think we need to give Ukraine some credit there. It is a pluralistic society, actually very bottom-up democratic. I mean, it was twice the Ukrainians went out onto the street and pushed out their corrupt governments, their corrupt presidents, because they wanted a better future. So again, I disagree a little bit with the assessment there.
Yeah, no, and again, I'm not disagreeing with what you say at all. I agree 100% with your points. What the point I'm trying to make is there's over 100,000 Dominion of Newfoundland and Canadians buried in Europe. Over 100,000 we've been going across the pond. At some point, we need people to get with the program. And I totally agree that Ukraine, Afghanistan, none of these countries necessarily are similar in conflicts. I'm just making a point that at some point, if we as the West have got ideals, then we need to, and we want to flourish and our prosperity is built on those ideals, then we need to be prepared to protect those nations that wish to join our community of nations in the way we live. That's, I guess, what I was trying to make. So I don't disagree with your points whatsoever, because I actually don't think it's the people's fault. It's the governing structure they have. That's causing the challenge.
All right.
If I might, from the historian's point of view, 30 years is next to nothing. Social change, economic change, political change, these things work themselves out over half centuries and centuries. And I think, yes, Ukraine doesn't seem to have made progress in some ways, in others it has, but 30 years is a very short time considering not only the communist imperium, but the bloodlands phenomenon that haunts its history. So I think we have to be a little bit more tolerant of people working out their destiny at their own pace.
All right, then. I think I'm going to call it at this point in time. Tremendous discussions, tremendous information, interesting perspectives, and varied perspectives. And I think that's key. You know, one of the subjects in the course I'm currently teaching is, you know, wicked problems. What are wicked problems? Well, we talked about a bunch of wicked problems today, and there are no simple solutions to any of these issues, obviously. So let me say before we close, I've got some people I need to thank. The RCMI is a team, and these sorts of events don't happen on their own. So people like Susan Cook and Sylvia Lau, Eric Morse, and Thanuja Surindam are the behind the curtain folks that make everything work, and they put a tremendous amount of effort into it. And as an example, we're able yesterday, you know, to pivot to a new run of show, a new lineup of speakers, and make it look fairly smooth, which I think it did. So they're a tremendous bunch of people. I'd like to thank Major General Holman for agreeing to be a moderator. A tremendous job. And again, very pleased that he's a part of the committee that we have in the RCMI that is focused on defense and security studies issues. Shout out to President Rod Seifert. This was his first rodeo with the conference, and so feeling his way around, he's discovered that this is an extremely busy volunteer job that he has taken on. And I think he's been hit between the eyes with the responsibility, but so far he's managing it exceptionally well, and he's highly supportive of all of the various programs that are part of the RCMI. I would then obviously like to thank all of our speakers. We have learned a great deal from you today. I think people have been well informed. And I thank you for your flexibility with the change of program. You know, surprise is a characteristic of administration, at least it is in the Canadian Armed Forces. So we have to learn how to be flexible and adapt. So I think we did that very well. So I want to thank you for taking the time and the effort that you have made to make this conference, I think, a success. So with that, I thank everybody. Please have a pleasant evening. Please stay safe. Please no more casualties to the COVID-19 that is still out there. Dr. Renz, I look forward perhaps to seeing you back at CFC at some point in time. And I look forward to seeing everybody at some point at the Long Bar in the RCMI, which is where the real learning takes place after the event is over and we're having a glass of wine and having a chat. So that's where the real learning takes place. And thank you very much for all of your attendance. And I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care and stay safe.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.